The Quran, chapter 4, verse 157, says that the Jews boasted that they killed and crucified Jesus Christ, the Son of Mary, but they didn't kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it was only made to appear to them, or it only looked like they did, but in reality, they killed Jesus not, but Allah or God took him on to himself. The Quran, chapter 4, verse 157 to 158. So what does this verse entail, and why does the New Testament documents or Christian tradition completely contradict these Quranic verses? And what's true, the Quranic verses, or the New Testament accounts? So I'm here to explain the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157, and why the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157 actually has a lot of is actually reflecting, or is actually confirming, what the earliest Christians believed about Jesus's last days on earth. So before we even get into this, we need to get into the Q gospel. Now, according to many biblical scholars, according to many New Testament scholars, the Q gospel did exist. Now, there's a growing notion that the Q gospel didn't exist. However, New Testament scholars are kind of divided on this issue. There's evidence for the Q gospel, and there are people who say, well, there's evidence against it. So I'm just going to go with the consensus of scholars and say, yes, the Q gospel did exist. And the reason why we don't have any manuscripts of it is because it's possible that the Q gospel was destroyed or lost over time. After all, if you read the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, Luke, the author of Luke, is saying that he used previous documents to write his gospel. So this lends credence to the existence of the Q gospel, which was lost or destroyed over time. Now, I can't really get into the existence of Q or whatever, because that's going to take way too long to do that, and I'm trying to keep this video as short as possible. But I recommend reading this book called Excavating Q by John S. Cloenberg, the history and setting of the Sayings Gospel, where he talks about how there was a Q gospel which predated the letters of Paul and the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the rest of the New Testament writing. So he goes in, or he explains why the Q gospel most likely existed, and how it disappeared over time, and what the contents of the Q gospel were. The Q gospel is not like a story gospel. It doesn't have the life of Jesus in chronological order like the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do. Rather, it was the sayings gospel. It only preserved the sayings of Jesus in Greek from an Aramaic source. Keep in mind, Jesus and the disciples spoke Aramaic, not Greek, the language the New Testament is written in. So basically, he goes into how the Q gospel existed, and how it preserved the sayings of Jesus, etc., and how the Q gospel actually originated from where Jesus was from, which was, modern day Palestine, and and how the oral traditions of Jesus were circulating and were eventually written in this Q document. So, anyways, I recommend getting this book, buying this book, and seeing what his conclusions about the Q gospel are. He makes a really good case that the Q gospel actually existed. Now, getting back to the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157, and about what happened to Jesus and why the New Testament says something, why the New Testament documents say something different. Now, I've always defended the swoon theory. The swoon theory is basically the theory that Jesus was crucified, yet he survived his crucifixion and he was taken down alive. In other words, he didn't die on the cross like Christians say he did, and like the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, like the New Testament says he did, not just the Gospels, but the letters of Paul, the book of Revelation, the rest of the New Testament documents. Now, first of all, we need to ask ourselves, uh, do we believe in God and do we believe in the supernatural? Jews, Christians, and Muslims believe in the supernatural. They believe in God. They believe that God can do things that God can do things through His prophets, or do miraculous things through His prophets. Now, of course, Jews don't believe in Jesus, so we can. And Jews don't believe in Muhammad either. Modern day Jews don't believe in Jesus or Muhammad. So so I'm not gonna be talking about that here. But Jews believed in the supernatural, Christians believe in the supernatural, Muslims believe in the supernatural. So and so then my theory is that because we can agree as theists that the supernatural exists in the world, because that's what as Christians and Muslims our belief system um, entails that, or tells us to believe that. So if we can believe in the supernatural, it's not far-fetched to say that God could have kept Jesus alive through the whole ordeal. I mean, in a world where God exists, that's certainly possible. So let's look into some of the evidence that shows that Jesus could have survived. Now, first of all, um, we're told in the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 32, that Jesus was taken down the same day he was put up, without the breaking of his legs, unlike the others who were crucified with him. Um, Death by crucifixion typically took days, and breaking the legs is based on the passage of John chapter 19, verse 32, is taken as a possible means of hastening death by perhaps cutting off the airway under the weight of the crucified person's body. So basically, if we read the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, verse 44, it shows that Pontius Pilate, expressed his amazement of Jesus' early demise. So basically, even Pontius Pilate was surprised that they declared Jesus dead. So then we need to explain how did Jesus survive his scourging and torture before the crucifixion, but that is not necessary. All victims of crucifixion were routinely scourged and tortured beforehand, and thus, if people regularly survived for days, and all the evidence suggests they did, this means they regularly survived for days despite additional scourging and torture. So just because Jesus was tortured and scourged before the crucifixion, that doesn't mean that weakened him to the point where he was dead by being nailed to the cross. Basically, there was an ancient Jewish historian who was writing after Jesus's, after the rise of Christianity. His name was Josephus. Josephus says in the life of Flavius Josephus, he says that he saw three people crucified. One was taken, and all three of them were taken down, and one survived. So surviving the crucifixion in those times was certainly possible. But we're dealing in a world where God exists. We're dealing in a world where the supernatural exists. So God could have kept Jesus alive through the whole ordeal. So, if Christians believe in the virgin birth, if Christians believe in Jesus doing miracles, Jesus healing people, etc., which is found in the Gospels, of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, etc., why is it so difficult to believe that God could have kept Jesus alive through the whole crucifixion? That's certainly possible in a world where God exists. Basically, so then they might be saying, well, what about the spearing? What about uh, the fact that Jesus was actually speared, and uh, uh, does that confirm his death? No, it doesn't, because first of all, only the Gospel of John records a spear wound, that Jesus was speared. And blood and water came out. Uh, you know, they suggest that it's a mortal wound, that Jesus was speared near the heart, and that caused his death. Well, this spear thrust issue is probably an invention. In other words, it didn't happen. The author of the Gospel of John was basically making this stuff up, because if we read in 1 John chapter 5 verse 6 to 8, it says that there was a belief that the Messiah would come with blood and water. 1 John chapter 5 verse 6 to 8, and that's what happened when Jesus was speared with the spear thrust. Jesus' blood and water came out, which was representing baptism and death. Consequently, several church fathers, Ambius, Justine, Chrysostom, understood that the spearing passage was symbolic and not literal. The blood represented the Eucharist, the water represented baptism. Moreover, Raymond Brown, in his book The Death of the Messiah, a 2-volume book, and Raymond Brown is a Christian scholar, not some anti-supernatural liberal scholar. He actually agrees that the spear thrust of Jesus was actually a invention by the author of the Gospel of John. It was not it wasn't a historical fact that Jesus was speared near the heart, etc. It was a invention by the author of the Gospel of John. In other words, the spearing of Jesus never happened. So we can already tell by these facts that it seems like the odds of Jesus surviving seem very good. Keep in mind that death by crucifixion took days. Death by crucifixion typically took days, and Jesus was only on the cross for a few hours. So that's even better. That's even better odds that Jesus actually survived the crucifixion. Basically, if you're crucified, if you're on the cross, if you're nailed to a cross for, I don't know, 3 hours, 4 hours, whatever, you're gonna survive. You're not going to die. That's probably what we're dealing with here. Basically, the case for Jesus' survival seemed very good at that. And the fact that God was working through Jesus, it's certainly possible that God kept Jesus alive through the whole ordeal. That's, in a world where God exists, that's certainly a possibility. So then, now going back to the Q Gospel, there's this really good book that was actually recommended by Shabir Ali, and I have to give him a lot of credit. Shabir Ali actually did some pretty good research here, but there was a really good book called Revisiting the Empty Tomb, The Early History of Easter by Daniel A. Smith. He also wrote another book called The Post-Mortem Vindication of Jesus, which was his PhD thesis, I believe, where he argues that according to the Q Gospel, which I just talked about a little bit ago, according to the Q Gospel, there was an early belief that Jesus was assumed into heaven from the tomb, from his tomb. Keep in mind, after Jesus was crucified and was taken down, he was placed in a tomb, according to the ending of the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So according to the Gospels, according to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus was placed in a tomb. But for some reason, the Paul doesn't talk about the empty tomb of Jesus. And I think the reason why, I think Michael Kona's reasoning for this was because it was already assumed that Jesus was, entombed. He was put into the tomb. So it was already a tradition, back when Paul was writing. Michael Kona also says that Michael Kona also says that 75% of Christian scholars believe that Jesus' tomb was empty. So we're going to just go. We're going to go with the empty tomb because there seems to be some evidence supporting it according to Christian scholars. So we're just going to go with it. For the exact references for the empty tomb, see the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 1 to 18. Basically, just read the endings of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I'll get into that. I'll get into that a little bit later. So, anyways, basically, according to the Q Gospel, according to Daniel A. Smith, according to the Q Gospel, there was basically two traditions circulating in the earliest years of Christianity. One tradition was the empty tomb tradition. The empty tomb tradition, talked about the empty tomb tradition, which came from the Q Gospel, talked about Jesus' disappearance, where Jesus disappeared from the tomb and was translated or was assumed into heaven from the tomb, never to be seen again until his return at the end of time. The other tradition was the appearance tradition, where Jesus was seen by his followers after his death. And so basically there were two traditions going on, circulating in the earliest years of Christianity. It was Jesus' disappearance and Jesus' appearance. So Jesus' disappearance entailed a assumption into heaven. Jesus' appearance entailed a resurrection of Jesus. So basically, the Q Gospel preserved the disappearance of Jesus, while Paul, who was the earliest New Testament writer, circulated the appearance tradition. These two traditions remained separate until they began to be brought together, in the Gospel according to Mark. And I'll talk about how Mark was influenced by Paul's Gospel in a little bit. The other three canonical Gospels, which would be the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John, as well as the other New Testament documents, accepted Paul's harmonization of the two traditions and developed their resurrection narratives based on Mark's innovation. Now, in this book, in chapter 1, Daniel A. Smith talks about how there were disappearance traditions in the ancient world. So there was a belief in the Jewish in pre-Christian Judaism about people disappearing from earth and going directly into heaven, like Elijah and Enoch in the Old Testament. In chapter 2 of that book, he talks about how Paul was the first one to come up with the resurrection of Jesus in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 7. Where Paul's tradition was an appearance tradition only. So basically, Paul was the first one to come up with Jesus' appearance or Jesus' resurrection tradition in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 7. Basically, and then he talks about on chapter 3, he talks about how people would interpret disappearance of bodies from tombs, and how in the Jewish context, which was where Jesus came from a Jewish context. Persons were more likely to interpret an empty tomb as a sign of bodily assumption into heavens, and not as a sign of resurrection. Basically, in chapter 4, he argues that the empty tomb provided evidence that God had vindicated Jesus by taking him up into a heavenly realm. So the Q gospel preserved this disappearance tradition. And it was Paul who was proclaiming an appearance tradition, while congregations with the Q gospel were promoting a disappearance tradition. And then in chapters 6 to 8, he demonstrates how the canonical gospels, harmonize this tradition. So basically, there were the person who came up with Jesus' death and resurrection was Paul of Tarsus, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I want to focus on the empty tomb. Now, does the empty tomb prove that Jesus was resurrected, as opposed to being assumed into heaven? And I would say no, it doesn't. In the gospel accounts, if we read the gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, nobody sees Jesus rise from the dead. Nobody actually sees the resurrection. They only observe a missing body and are later visited by Jesus. People like Christian apologists like William Lane Craig and Michael Licona, etc., would sidestep this issue by focusing on the empty tomb. Regardless, they fail to mention that nobody actually sees the resurrection of Jesus. Nobody actually sees. Nobody actually was in the tomb and actually waiting for, or actually witnesses Jesus physically getting up and rising from the dead and walking out of the tomb. Basically, the women followers, according to the Gospel of Mark chapter 16 verses 1 to 8, go to the tomb and they see a young boy there. The young boy is usually interpreted to be an angel, and the angel says that Jesus, who was crucified, is not here; he has risen. So basically, nobody actually sees. The women followers, who were the only ones who actually went to the tomb after the crucifixion, don't get to see what happened to Jesus in the tomb. Here, hang on, let me just read that passage real quickly. It says, it says, and it's talking about the women followers. I'm reading from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 4 to 8. It says, "But when they looked up, they saw the stone, and it was very large, had been rolled away. And they entered the tomb. They saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed." He said, "Don't be alarmed." He said, "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So basically, the angel or the boy is telling the women to go to Galilee, for they will see Jesus. So basically, it's possible that, if they go to Galilee, they would see a vision of Jesus, and not like a resurrected, full resurrected body. Now, this is where it gets interesting because, according to all New Testament scholars, everybody from Bart Ehrman to people like Daniel A. Wallace to, every New Testament scholar would basically admit that the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 9 to 20, the actual resurrection of Jesus is not in the earliest New Testament documents. It's not in the it's not, or I'm sorry, it's not in the New Testament, earliest New Testament manuscripts. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 9 to 20, the actual resurrection of Jesus, according to the Gospel of Mark, was actually added later on. It was actually added in the in another. It was added in a later manuscripts. For example, I have the Bible I usually use is the Archaeological Study Bible, and on page 1661, it says that the in the two oldest Greek manuscripts in a number of ancient versions, Mark's Gospel ends at chapter 16 uh, verse 8. Uh, you know, so basically, this ending was not there in the earliest Greek New Testament. Uh, it was only added later. It was only added later on. Uh, as for New Testament scholarship on the authorship of the New Testament, strictly speaking, the many of the New Testament documents are anonymous documents since the authors do not name themselves. The vast majority of scholars find the various authorship traditions problematic for a variety of reasons. For example, so the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were actually written anonymously, and later on in the second century, people said, "Yeah, Mark wrote this gospel, Matthew wrote this gospel, etc." But in reality, they were originally anonymous, according to the conclusions of conservative scholars. For example, according to a conservative scholar, Tom Wright, he says that what do we know about how the Gospels got written? Frustratingly, a little. He also says none of the books, the Gospels, name their authors. All their traditions about who wrote which ones are just that, traditions from later on in the life of the church. See Tom Wright, the original Life of Jesus, the life and vision of a revolutionary, pages 126 to 127, etc., etc. But getting back to Raymond Brown's book, so basically, Raymond Brown is a well-respected uh, Christian author, Christian scholar. He died a little bit ago, but anyways, his book Introduction to the New Testament is highly recommended. He writes on pages 639 to 673 to page 600, page 621, page 726 that 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus is authored by an unknown person. Then he writes that the book of James is pseudonymous. In other words, it was written anonymously, not by James. He also states that that most scholars regard 1 Peter to be synonymous or anonymous. So in other words, Peter didn't write 1 Peter or 2 Peter. And many of the John epistles are widely deemed to be anonymous as well. 2 Thessalonians is, scholars are divided whether Paul wrote it or not. Again, this is the Introduction to the New Testament by Raymond Brown, pages 639, 654, 673, 551, page 600, page 621, page 726. So, in other words, Peter didn't write 1 Peter, James didn't write the book of James. There's a lot of dispute as to who wrote the Pauline epistles, or who wrote 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, etc., etc. There's dispute over who wrote 1 Peter, who wrote Colossians, who wrote Ephesians. Many of these books are said to be anonymous and pseudonymous. In other words, we don't know who wrote them. So how can we trust people we don't even know? How can I be 100% certain that the disciples were teaching Jesus' death and resurrection when we don't know who wrote a majority of the New Testament to begin with? Hebrews is also thought to be anonymous, according to Raymond Brown, etc., etc. So basically, there's a consensus among conservative Christian scholars that many of the writings of the New Testament are anonymous. In other words, they are they weren't written by who they claim to be written by. For example, 1 Peter is really an anonymous book. 2 Peter is an anonymous book. Hebrews, we don't know who wrote the letter of Hebrews, etc., etc. We don't know who wrote the book of James, etc., etc. So none of the New Testament books are actually written by the disciples, since the disciples were said to be illiterate. See Acts chapter 4, verse 13. And another problem was the disciples spoke in Aramaic. They didn't know anything. They didn't know any Greek. And the New Testament books are written in Greek and not in Aramaic. Thus, it's impossible for the disciples to have written the any of the documents of the New Testament. So this is a book I would recommend, Raymond Brown, in Introduction to the New Testament, to see who wrote the the New Testament, why the New Testament books were originally anonymous. I also recommend Bart Ehrman's book Forged, where he talks about how the New Testament books, a lot of New Testament books are actually forged, and why the disciples couldn't have used secretaries to write down, their books or their letters. So he goes into how many of the New Testament books are actually forged, or were not written by the authors they were claimed to be written by. So basically he goes through, he talks about how Peter could not have written 1 and 2 Peter, how there were forgeries in the name of Paul, and how forgery was actually condemned, in ancient times, etc., etc. So he writes about like how the pastoral letters were forged, where he talks about, why people would actually forge these books, etc., etc. So it's a really good book. It's called Forged by Bart Ehrman. He really goes into, he goes into, heavy detail as to, how many of the New Testament books are actually forged. He actually argues for many of the books to be forged in the New Testament. Hang on, let me just pull up the books he thinks are forged. In his book Forged, Bart Ehrman argues that the following books are that 11 or more out of the 27 books of the New Testament canon were written as forgeries. So basically, the New Testament books identified as forgeries by Bart Ehrman would include First Epistle of Peter, Second Epistle of Peter, Acts of the Apostles, Epistle of James, Epistle of Jude, Second Epistle to the Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, the Epistle of Titus, Epistle of Ephesians, Epistle of Colossians. So basically, we don't know who wrote Acts of the Apostles. We don't know who wrote 1 Peter, 2 Peter, the Epistle of James, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, none of the, according to the scholarship and the research of Dr. Bart Ehrman in his book Forge, he argues that we can't trust the New Testament because we don't know who wrote them. They were written by anonymous, highly educated and highly trained anonymous Greek-speaking Christians living after the first generation of Christians. The first generation of Christians would be the disciples, the immediate disciples of Jesus. So basically, Paul's gospel beat out the disciples' gospel, and Paul's idea or Paul's gospel of Jesus dying and being resurrected was spread throughout places like Turkey, Rome, Palestine, Egypt, etc. So that's how Paul's gospel was spread. Keep in mind, Paul was an apostle to the Gentiles. Thus, his gospel beat out the disciples' gospel. So, conclusions. Jesus survived the crucifixion with the help of God and was taken down from the cross alive. He was then buried in the tomb. From the tomb, God took him from the tomb directly to heaven. Thus that explains the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157. Jesus appeared in visions to the disciples. They are preaching Jesus is alive and assumed into heaven. However, Paul comes along and preaches that Jesus was killed by crucifixion and resurrected for some reason. Paul was probably influenced by the Old Testament scriptures to say this in his own subjective visions. Anyways, his gospel beats out the disciples' gospel because keep in mind Paul was a apostle or a disciple. Paul was an apostle to the Gentiles. So his gospel beats out the disciples' gospel and influences the other New Testament documents. Thus, we got Jesus' death and resurrection tradition. That's how we got Jesus' death and resurrection tradition. It was a false tradition made up by Paul. And the disciples weren't teaching it. Paul was the one who was teaching it. And Paul's gospel was the one that prevailed over the disciples' gospel. So Christianity was made up by Paul and not the disciples. Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. Jesus' crucifix Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection was made up by Paul and not the disciples. And whoever and the anonymous authors of the New Testament documents who were influenced by oral traditions of Paul's gospel as opposed to what the disciples were teaching. So Paul was the most successful Christian missionary as he messed up what the disciples were teaching, or he was more successful in spreading his gospel than what the true gospel of the disciples were. Stay tuned. The final videos are coming up.